I received a termination text message while standing next to NovaTek's CEO, Marcus Rodriguez, at a $2,000 per plate charity gala. The message from my boss Derek read, "Effective immediately. Your employment is terminated. Security will escort you out Monday morning. Your access has been revoked." I stood frozen in my black evening gown, phone trembling in my hand. Marcus noticed my distress, read the message over my shoulder, and his face darkened with fury. Without a word, he pulled out his own phone and began typing a message that would destroy my former company. 8 months earlier, my life looked completely different. I was Madeline Patterson, 32 years old, working at Pinnacle Solutions, a mid-sized government contracting firm tucked away in a modest office building in Arlington, Virginia. The company occupied 3 floors of what used to be a bank building, with outdated furniture and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a slightly sickly pallor. My background was solid but unremarkable in the defense contracting world. 6 years as an Air Force logistics officer had taught me how government procurement really worked, not the idealized version they teach in business schools, but the grinding reality of moving equipment, managing budgets, and dealing with contractors who ranged from exceptionally competent to borderline criminal. After my military service ended, I transitioned into civilian contracting because I believed I could make a difference by helping honest companies serve the government more effectively. Pinnacle Solutions was supposed to be one of those honest companies. Derek Hartman, the CEO and founder, had built his reputation on what he called aggressive but ethical business practices. He was a smooth-talking man in his 50s with perfectly styled gray hair and expensive suits that somehow made our shabby offices look even more depressing by comparison. Derek had started Pinnacle 15 years earlier with 2 employees and a single small contract. Through what he described as creative contract management and strategic relationship building, he had grown the company to nearly 200 employees. But when I joined Pinnacle 18 months before the Gala incident, the company was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. We had lost 3 major contracts to larger competitors in the previous year, and the mood in the office was somewhere between desperate and defeated. Layoffs were rumored weekly, and several of our best employees had already jumped ship to more stable companies. The quarterly review meeting that changed everything took place on a gray February morning in Derek's corner office. The entire senior staff was crammed around his conference table, which was covered with financial reports that painted a grim picture of our future. Derek laid out the numbers with the kind of brutal honesty that only comes when a company is staring into the abyss. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have approximately 6 months of operating capital remaining," Derek announced, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something approaching panic. "Unless we land a significant new contract soon, we're looking at massive layoffs by September and possible bankruptcy by the end of the year." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in that room knew that finding a major new contract in 6 months was nearly impossible in our industry. Government contracting moves slowly, with proposal processes that often take longer than our remaining runway. That's when I made the proposal that would eventually lead to both my greatest professional triumph and most devastating personal betrayal. I had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since I had started researching NovaTek Corporation and their massive federal cybersecurity contracts. "I want to target NovaTek's federal cybersecurity contract," I announced, breaking the heavy silence. "It's a $45 million opportunity that perfectly matches our capabilities." The room erupted in nervous laughter. Sarah Chen, our finance director, actually snorted. "Madeline, NovaTek doesn't work with companies our size. They're in the big leagues. Their smallest contracts are larger than our entire annual revenue." Derek's initial reaction was similar skepticism, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. $45 million was more money than Derek had probably ever imagined Pinnacle handling. Even if we could compete for something that big, Derek said carefully, we don't have the connections. NovaTek's contracts go to companies with relationships that go back decades. But I had been doing my homework for months. I had been studying NovaTek's corporate culture, their decision-making processes, and most importantly, their leadership team. The key was Marcus Rodriguez, their CEO and founder, a former Marine colonel who had built NovaTek from a garage startup to a billion-dollar government contractor. Marcus had a well-documented commitment to supporting veteran-owned businesses and maintaining the highest ethical standards in an industry sometimes known for cutting corners. I've been researching Marcus Rodriguez and NovaTek's corporate philosophy, I explained to the skeptical room. They prioritize working with veteran-owned businesses, and they value ethical practices over pure cost savings. We can compete on those terms. What I didn't tell the room was that I had already made contact with Marcus Rodriguez 6 months earlier at an industry conference in Denver. It wasn't a chance encounter. I had specifically registered for that conference, spent my own money on travel and accommodations, because I knew Marcus would be delivering the keynote address on ethical leadership in defense contracting. The networking reception after his speech was my opportunity. I approached Marcus not with a sales pitch or business card ready, but with genuine respect for his military service and curiosity about his transition from leading Marines to leading a corporation. "Colonel Rodriguez," I said, using his former military rank as a sign of respect that immediately caught his attention. "Your presentation about maintaining military values in civilian business really resonated with me. As a former Air Force officer myself, I've struggled with some of the practices I've seen in the civilian contracting world." That conversation lasted 45 minutes and covered everything from leadership philosophy to the challenges of maintaining ethical standards under competitive pressure. Marcus was impressed by my military background, my honest assessment of industry problems, and my innovative ideas about how smaller companies could provide better value to the government by combining agility with integrity. Over the following months, I invested every spare moment in building what became an 18-month professional relationship with Marcus and his team. I attended every industry event where NovaTek was represented. I researched their past contracts, their corporate partners, and their strategic priorities. Most importantly, I began developing a comprehensive proposal that would revolutionize how they approached federal cybersecurity contracts. My proposal was revolutionary because it combined Pinnacle's advantages as a smaller, more agile company with NovaTek's resources and reputation. Instead of competing on price alone, we would offer something larger companies couldn't match: personalized attention, rapid response times, and innovative solutions unconstrained by bureaucratic overhead. I worked 18-hour days for months, sacrificing weekends, missing family gatherings, and pouring every ounce of my military training and civilian experience into creating something truly exceptional. The technical specifications alone took me 3 months to develop, requiring consultation with cybersecurity experts, federal compliance lawyers, and former military colleagues who understood government requirements. Derek's attitude toward my efforts shifted dramatically when he began to understand the contract's true value and my growing relationship with Marcus Rodriguez. His initial skepticism transformed into greedy enthusiasm. Suddenly, he was inserting himself into every aspect of what he started calling the NovaTek initiative. He began attending meetings I had arranged, taking credit for strategies I had developed, and positioning himself as the visionary leader behind our bold expansion into major government contracting. The contract negotiations took 4 months of intensive back and forth between our companies. Marcus Rodriguez personally reviewed our proposal and was impressed by the depth of research and innovation we brought to cybersecurity challenges. But what really convinced NovaTek to choose Pinnacle over three larger, more established competitors was the personal trust Marcus had developed in my judgment and integrity. The contract signing ceremony 3 months ago should have been the pinnacle of my career. The event took place in NovaTek's corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass building in Reston, Virginia, with panoramic views of the Washington area. Defense industry leaders, federal officials, and local politicians attended the ceremony celebrating what Marcus called a new model of public-private partnership. Derek stood at the podium that day, shaking hands with Marcus Rodriguez and accepting congratulations from industry leaders who had previously never heard of Pinnacle Solutions. He delivered a speech about visionary leadership and strategic innovation that carefully avoided mentioning my role in developing the partnership. I sat in the audience, wearing my best business suit and trying to smile while watching Derek claim credit for 18 months of my work. The irony was bitter. The contract that was supposed to represent my greatest professional achievement was being celebrated as Derek's triumph. But privately, Derek acknowledged the truth. After the ceremony, in his office with the door closed, he looked me in the eye and said, "Madeline, I hope you know that you made this happen. This contract is going to save our company, and frankly, it's going to make us all rich." He was right about saving the company. The NovaTek contract generated 60% of Pinnacle's annual revenue almost immediately. We hired 47 new employees, upgraded our entire technology infrastructure, and secured 3 additional smaller contracts based on our enhanced reputation in the industry. But something was wrong. Despite our newfound financial stability, Derek's management style was becoming increasingly toxic. He treated the new employees like disposable resources, implemented arbitrary cost-cutting measures that made no business sense, and began displaying the kind of arrogance that comes from sudden wealth and power. Most troubling to me was Derek's attitude toward the NovaTek contract itself. Instead of treating it as a responsibility to serve the government effectively, he saw it as a personal cash machine. His conversations about billing and cost management made me increasingly uncomfortable, though I couldn't yet prove he was doing anything illegal. Looking back now, I realized that Derek's behavior during those months was the behavior of a man who believed he had outsmarted the system and could get away with anything. The contract I had worked so hard to secure was about to become the instrument of his destruction and the foundation of my vindication. The discovery that would change everything happened on a mundane Tuesday evening 2 weeks before the charity gala. I was staying late to review quarterly billing statements, a routine responsibility that had become more complex since we started managing the NovaTek contract. The office was nearly empty, with only the cleaning crew moving through the hallways and the distant hum of servers in our IT department. What I found in those billing documents made my blood run cold and my hands shake with a combination of rage and disbelief. Derek had been systematically inflating our costs by 30% across every aspect of the NovaTek contract, billing them for non-existent overtime hours, phantom equipment purchases, and consulting fees paid to companies that existed only on paper. The evidence was methodical and damning. Timesheets showing 80-hour weeks for employees who had been on vacation, equipment invoices for servers and networking hardware that were never installed in our offices, consulting payments to firms with addresses that led to vacant lots or mail forwarding services. I spent the entire night cross-referencing documents, building a comprehensive file that detailed every fraudulent charge. The scope of Derek's theft was staggering. In just 3 months since the contract began, he had stolen approximately $2.7 million through various billing schemes that violated not just our contract terms, but federal laws governing contractor fraud. By the time the sun rose, I had compiled a 40-page report with supporting documentation that could destroy Derek's career and potentially send him to prison. but I also realized that exposing his fraud would probably destroy Pinnacle Solutions and cost nearly 200 innocent employees their jobs. The next morning, I requested a private meeting with Derek in his office. My hands were steady as I laid out the evidence on his expensive mahogany desk, but my heart was pounding like I was walking into enemy fire. I had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during my sleepless night, but nothing could have prepared me for Derek's actual response. "Derek, I've discovered serious irregularities in our billing to NovaTek," I began, keeping my voice professional and calm. "These documents show systematic overcharging that violates federal contracting regulations and basic ethical standards." Derek's reaction wasn't surprise, remorse, or even defensive explanations. Instead, his face went cold with calculating fury, like a predator whose territory had been invaded. "Madeline, I have to say I'm deeply disappointed in you," he said, his tone carrying the kind of condescending authority that made my military training bristle. "After everything I've done for you, after giving you the opportunity to work on the biggest contract in our company's history, this is how you repay my trust and confidence?" His words felt like a physical slap. I had expected denial, excuses, maybe even anger, but not this twisted narrative where my discovery of his crimes became a betrayal of his generosity. "Derek, this isn't about gratitude or loyalty," I replied, fighting to keep my voice level. "This is about fraud. We're stealing from the federal government. We're taking money that's supposed to support national security and putting it in our own pockets." Derek stood up from behind his desk, his 6-foot frame towering over me in a gesture clearly designed to intimidate. "We're maximizing our profit margins on a contract that you brought us," he corrected, his voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher explaining obvious facts to a slow student. "The federal government expects contractors to be creative with billing structures. It's standard practice throughout the industry." "No, Derek, it's not standard practice," I shot back, my own military bearing helping me stand firm despite his attempt at intimidation. "It's criminal fraud, and you know it." Derek's mask of reasonable authority finally slipped, revealing the ruthless opportunist underneath. "Let me make something very clear to you, Madeline. You are expendable. Despite what you might think about your importance to this company, you can be replaced. Don't forget who really runs Pinnacle Solutions. I built this company from nothing, and I can destroy your career with a single phone call to the right people in this industry." The threat was explicit and chilling. Derek wasn't just refusing to correct his billing fraud. He was making it clear that exposing him would result in professional retaliation that could end my career in government contracting. I gave him 48 hours to correct the billing irregularities and return the stolen money to NovaTek. "If you don't fix this, Derek, I'll have no choice but to file a formal complaint with federal auditors." Derek's response was swift, systematic, and cruel beyond anything I could have imagined. Over the next 2 weeks, he launched a campaign to isolate and undermine me that was clearly designed to destroy my credibility before I could expose his crimes. First, he excluded me from all meetings related to the NovaTek contract, the very contract I had created and managed since its inception. When I objected, he told other staff members that I was having performance issues and needed to be managed more closely. Then he began spreading rumors about my mental stability and professional competence. In conversations with other employees, Derek suggested that I was struggling with the pressure of managing such a large contract and showing signs of unrealistic expectations and paranoid thinking. The psychological warfare was expertly executed. Colleagues who had previously respected my work began avoiding me in the hallways. People stopped including me in lunch plans and informal discussions. The professional relationships I had built over 18 months at Pinnacle began evaporating as Derek systematically poisoned my reputation. But Derek's masterstroke of calculated cruelty was scheduling my termination for the charity gala where he knew Marcus Rodriguez would be present. The Veterans Support Foundation Gala was one of the defense industry's most prestigious networking events, attended by over 200 government officials, contractors, military leaders, and politicians. Derek had purchased a table for Pinnacle Solutions at the event, spending company money on what he justified as essential relationship building. He invited me to attend, even insisting that I buy an expensive evening gown for the occasion because we need to present the right image for the company. What I didn't understand until later was that Derek had calculated every aspect of my public humiliation. By firing me via text message while I stood in a ballroom full of industry leaders, he was demonstrating his power while simultaneously discrediting any future accusations I might make about his criminal behavior. Derek's plan was diabolically clever. Fire me publicly to humiliate me, then spread the narrative that I was a disgruntled employee whose accusations about billing irregularities were motivated by revenge rather than genuine concern about fraud. He believed that destroying my professional reputation would protect him from the consequences of his crimes. What Derek failed to understand was the depth of the professional relationship I had built with Marcus Rodriguez, and Marcus's unwavering commitment to the ethical principles that had guided his transition from military service to corporate leadership. As I stood in that ballroom, wearing the black evening gown I had purchased specifically for this event, Derek's termination text felt like a knife between my shoulder blades. But Marcus Rodriguez's presence next to me was about to transform this moment of betrayal into the beginning of Derek's complete destruction. Marcus Rodriguez was not just another CEO attending a charity gala. The former Marine colonel had built NovaTek on principles forged in combat zones from Iraq to Afghanistan and tested in corporate boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made with lives hanging in the balance. His reputation for loyalty, integrity, and unwavering support for military veterans was legendary throughout the defense contracting industry. When Marcus read Derek's termination text message over my shoulder, his reaction was immediate and decisive. The transformation in his demeanor was like watching a switch flip from polite corporate executive to commanding military officer facing a threat to his mission. "Madeline, this is very interesting timing," Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded Marines in hostile territory. "Would you mind if I share something with you about the specific terms of our contract with Pinnacle?" Still reeling from the shock of Derek's text message, I could only nod while trying to process what was happening around me. The gala continued its elegant chaos around us, but I felt like Marcus and I were suddenly occupying our own bubble of corporate warfare. When NovaTek's board of directors was reviewing proposals for this cybersecurity contract 8 months ago, we had 3 finalists, Marcus explained, his voice measured and deliberate. 2 of those proposals came from companies with revenues exceeding $500 million, companies with decades of experience in major federal contracting. I stared at him, my mind still struggling to connect his words to Derek's termination message and the implications for my career. The deciding factor that convinced our board to choose Pinnacle Solutions wasn't price, wasn't past performance, and wasn't even technical capabilities, Marcus continued. The deciding factor was you, specifically your military background, your ethical approach to government contracting, and your innovative solutions to cybersecurity challenges. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "You mean the contract was awarded based on my involvement?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Not just awarded based on your involvement, but structured to require your continued participation. Our legal team included specific key personnel provisions in the contract that designate you as essential to all major project decisions. Derek Hartman cannot modify, transfer, or terminate your role without NovaTek's explicit written consent. The implications began crashing over me in waves. Derek hadn't just fired an employee. He had violated the core terms of a $45 million federal contract. So, Derek's termination text message, I began, constitutes a material breach of contract that triggers our default and termination provisions, Marcus finished. Derek Hartman has just handed us legal grounds to cancel the entire contract and pursue damages for breach. Marcus pulled out his phone with the deliberate slowness of someone making a decision that would destroy another person's career. The gold ballroom lighting reflected off the screen as he began typing a message with military precision. "What are you doing?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "I'm sending Derek a message that will probably end his company and definitely end his career in government contracting," Marcus replied calmly. He showed me the screen before hitting send. "You just terminated your federal contract. Expect legal action." The message was transmitted to Derek's personal cell phone at exactly 9:37 p.m., according to the timestamp. The irony was perfect. The man who had just fired me via text message was receiving his own career death sentence through the same medium. Within 3 minutes, Derek's name appeared on Marcus's call log. Within 5 minutes, my phone was buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from Derek. The panic in his attempts to reach us was almost audible through the electronic signals. Marcus declined Derek's calls and suggested we find a quiet corner of the ballroom to discuss the situation in detail. We moved to a secluded seating area near the silent auction tables, where Marcus explained the full scope of Derek's strategic blunder. "Our contract includes liquidated damages provisions that could cost Pinnacle Solutions up to $15 million in penalties for unauthorized termination of key personnel," Marcus explained. "But more importantly for Derek personally, our legal team has been monitoring all contractor relationships closely, and we've noticed some irregularities in recent billing statements." I felt a moment of moral clarity that was like stepping out of fog into brilliant sunlight. Derek's fraud wasn't just my problem anymore. It was affecting the client I had worked so hard to serve with integrity. "Marcus, there's something you need to know about those billing irregularities you mentioned." For the next 30 minutes, I outlined everything I had discovered about Derek's fraudulent billing practices. Marcus listened with the focused attention of a military commander, receiving critical intelligence about enemy activities that threatened his mission. "Madeline, what you're describing isn't just contract fraud," Marcus said after I finished my explanation. "This is a systematic pattern of theft from the federal government. We're talking about potential criminal charges under the False Claims Act, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy statutes." As the gala wound down around us, with guests beginning to collect their coats and say their goodbyes, Marcus made me an offer that would fundamentally change the trajectory of my career and my life. "If you're interested, NovaTek has an immediate opening for a senior director of government relations. The position would involve working directly with federal clients to ensure contract compliance and ethical standards. Your background and recent experience with contractor fraud would make you uniquely qualified for the role." I looked down at the small gold pin on my dress lapel that identified me as a Pinnacle Solutions employee. In a moment of symbolic liberation that felt like shedding chains I hadn't realized were binding me, I removed the pin and dropped it into my champagne glass, where it sank to the bottom with a tiny splash. "I'm very interested in discussing that opportunity," I told Marcus. The next morning would bring FBI investigators, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of Derek's company. But in that moment, standing in a ballroom full of defense industry leaders while Derek's desperate phone calls went unanswered, I realized that his act of petty cruelty had actually liberated me from a toxic situation and launched me toward work that aligned with my deepest values. Derek had fired me, thinking he was destroying my career. Instead, he had just accelerated my promotion to a position where I could prevent other contractors from committing the same crimes he thought he could get away with forever. Monday morning arrived with all the subtlety of an earthquake. I drove to Pinnacle's offices in Arlington, expecting to find Derek in full damage control mode, perhaps with lawyers already crafting explanations for why my termination was justified. Instead, I walked into what could only be described as a crime scene investigation in progress. FBI fraud investigators were already in the building, having arrived at 6 a.m. with search warrants and evidence collection equipment. Derek was nowhere to be seen, but his assistant, Patricia, told me through tears that he had been making frantic phone calls since 4:30 in the morning, trying to reach attorneys, calling Marcus Rodriguez's office, and attempting to contact other major clients. "The FBI agents have been here for 3 hours, Patricia whispered, as we stood in the lobby watching federal investigators carry boxes of documents out of Derek's office. "They said something about a formal complaint filed this morning and evidence of systematic fraud." The scope of Derek's criminal activities was far beyond what even I had suspected during my initial investigation. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, the lead investigator on the case, explained that Derek had been systematically defrauding multiple federal clients, not just NovaTek, through sophisticated billing schemes that had been operating for over 2 years. "Miss Patterson," Agent Walsh said during our initial interview, "the evidence you compiled about the NovaTek billing irregularities helped us obtain search warrants for a much broader investigation. What we've found suggests that Derek Hartman has been stealing from the federal government on a scale that could reach $15 to $20 million. The methodical nature of Derek's fraud was breathtaking. He had created shell companies with convincing websites and fake employee profiles. He had established business relationships with legitimate subcontractors who unknowingly provided cover for his billing schemes. Most damaging of all, he had corrupted Pinnacle's accounting systems to automatically generate fraudulent invoices that looked completely legitimate to casual review. Sarah Chen, Pinnacle's finance director, and someone I had considered both a friend and a professional ally, broke down completely during her FBI interview. When she found me in the lobby afterward, her face was streaked with tears and her hands were shaking. "Madeline, I need you to know how sorry I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what Derek was doing. I've known for months. But I was terrified of losing my job and being blacklisted from the industry." Her confession was heartbreaking but not entirely surprising. Derek had ruled Pinnacle through a combination of fear and financial incentives that made good people feel trapped into silence. "I have 2 children and a mortgage," Sarah continued. "When I questioned some of the billing entries 6 months ago, Derek called me into his office and made it very clear that anyone who couldn't support the company's aggressive growth strategies would find themselves unemployed and unemployable in this industry." Sarah's experience was not unique. Over the course of that devastating Monday, 17 Pinnacle employees were interviewed by federal investigators, and most revealed similar stories of Derek's intimidation tactics and retaliation against anyone who questioned his methods. By noon, the local news had picked up the story. Channel 7's investigative reporter stood outside Pinnacle's building, delivering a live report. Federal investigators are conducting a major fraud investigation at Arlington-based defense contractor Pinnacle Solutions, following allegations of systematic overcharging on government contracts. The ripple effects were immediate and catastrophic for Derek's carefully constructed business empire. 3 other major federal clients immediately suspended their contracts, pending the outcome of the investigation. Pinnacle's stock, which traded on a regional exchange, plummeted 60% in the first 2 hours after news of the FBI raid broke. My phone had become unusable due to Derek's increasingly desperate attempts to contact me. His voicemails evolved throughout the day from angry threats to pathetic pleas that revealed the depth of his panic. "Madeline, this is ridiculous. We can work this out. I'll reinstate you immediately with a 25% raise and full authority over the NovaTek contract. I'm prepared to make you a full partner in the company. We can restructure the ownership to give you 40% equity. Please call me back. Madeline, please understand that my entire family's future depends on this company. My daughter is starting college in the fall. I'll give you anything you want. Name your price." But Derek's offers were meaningless because the damage he had inflicted was irreversible. I spent that afternoon in a conference room at NovaTek's headquarters, meeting with federal investigators and providing them with the detailed evidence I had compiled about Derek's fraudulent billing practices. What I learned during that meeting shocked me even more than Derek's crimes themselves. The FBI had been building a case against Derek for 4 months, since January, but they had been unable to move forward without an insider willing to provide evidence and testimony. "Miss Patterson," Agent Walsh explained, "our investigation began when a former Pinnacle employee contacted our fraud hotline with allegations about billing irregularities. But that employee had been terminated and couldn't provide the kind of detailed evidence we needed for criminal prosecution. The employee was Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the FBI agent who had quit Pinnacle 8 months earlier after Derek publicly humiliated her for questioning a billing discrepancy. She had tried to report Derek's fraud through official channels, but without access to internal documents, her allegations couldn't be substantiated. Your documentation and your position as the primary contact for the NovaTek contract gives us everything we need to pursue criminal charges," Agent Walsh continued. "Derek Hartman is looking at potential violations of the False Claims Act, wire fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy statutes. The personal cost of my decision was becoming clear as the day progressed. Some former colleagues were supportive and grateful that I had exposed Derek's crimes, but others blamed me for the chaos that was destroying their professional stability. Michael Torres, a project manager who had worked at Pinnacle for 6 years, cornered me in the parking garage late that afternoon. "Madeline, did you consider what this would do to the rest of us? I have a family to support, and now I'm probably going to be unemployed because of your vendetta against Derek." His anger was understandable but misplaced. Derek's crimes had made Pinnacle's collapse inevitable. My actions had simply accelerated a reckoning that was always coming. But Marcus Rodriguez's public statement that afternoon helped shift the narrative in my favor. NovaTek issued a press release that was picked up by every major defense industry publication. NovaTek Corporation stands firmly behind whistleblowers who report fraud and protect taxpayer dollars. Madeline Patterson's courage in exposing systematic billing fraud demonstrates exactly the kind of ethical leadership our industry needs to maintain public trust. We are proud to have worked with Miss Catterley Patterson and look forward to continuing our professional relationship. Industry publications transformed the story from disgruntled employee destroys company to ethical whistleblower exposes major fraud. Defense News ran a front-page article titled "NovaTek CEO Supports Contractor Fraud Whistleblower," which positioned my actions as part of a broader industry effort to eliminate corruption in government contracting. Derek, meanwhile, had hired one of Washington's most expensive white-collar criminal defense firms and begun a public relations campaign designed to shift blame away from himself and onto his employees. His attorney's statement to the media claimed that any billing irregularities were the result of accounting errors by overzealous staff members who misunderstood complex federal regulations. But Derek's attempts to save himself were already too late. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and more damaging than his individual crimes, was the revelation of his character that was emerging through former employees' stories about his management style and business practices. By the end of that catastrophic Monday, Pinnacle Solutions had lost contracts worth over $30 million, faced potential criminal charges involving $15 million in fraudulent billing, and was hemorrhaging employees as people began looking for jobs with companies that weren't under federal investigation. Derek's empire, built on fraud and intimidation, was collapsing in real time, and I was about to play a much more active role in ensuring that his destruction was complete and that justice was served for everyone he had harmed. The week following the FBI raid, I realized that simply cooperating with federal investigators wasn't enough to ensure justice. Derek had spent 2 weeks systematically destroying my professional reputation, and he was now attempting to save himself by blaming innocent employees for crimes he had orchestrated. I decided to take a more active and strategic role in building the case that would guarantee his conviction. My military training had taught me that successful operations require comprehensive intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and flawless execution. Derek had made the mistake of treating me like a victim, rather than recognizing me as a strategic opponent, with the skills and determination to destroy him completely. Using my extensive network of contacts throughout the defense industry, I began reaching out to former Pinnacle employees who had left the company due to Derek's toxic management style. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People who had been afraid to speak up while Derek held power over their careers were suddenly eager to share their stories of his retaliation, intimidation, and criminal behavior. Jennifer Walsh, who had quit 6 months earlier after Derek berated her in front of 30 colleagues for questioning a billing discrepancy, provided me with a treasure trove of evidence she had secretly compiled during her final months at the company. Her files included email threads where Derek explicitly instructed her to be more creative with billing calculations and voice recordings of him threatening to make sure she never worked in this industry again if she continued asking questions about accounting irregularities. Michael Torres, a former project manager who had left Pinnacle 3 months ago, shared recordings of Derek instructing him to inflate labor hours on federal contracts. Derek told me that if I wasn't willing to maximize revenue opportunities, he would find someone who was more committed to the company's success, Michael explained during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Washington. But the most damaging evidence came from Derek's own financial records, which I had inadvertently accessed during my investigation of the NovaTek billing fraud. Derek had been using offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg to launder his fraudulent profits, creating shell companies with impressive websites and fake employee profiles to justify payments that were actually going directly into his personal accounts. The sophistication of Derek's money laundering operation was remarkable. He had created 3 separate shell companies, each with different specializations in cybersecurity consulting, personnel training, and equipment procurement. The companies had professional websites, fake employee LinkedIn profiles, and even false testimonials from satisfied clients. Working with federal prosecutors became a full-time job that was more intellectually challenging and emotionally satisfying than anything I had done during my 18 months at Pinnacle. Prosecutors are excellent lawyers, but most lack the technical expertise necessary to understand sophisticated fraud schemes in government contracting. My background in military logistics and civilian contracting made me uniquely qualified to explain Derek's methods to a jury of ordinary citizens. Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Martinez became my primary point of contact in the prosecution effort. A former military lawyer herself, she understood both the legal complexities and the ethical implications of Derek's crimes. Madeline, Your expertise is invaluable in helping us understand not just what Derek did, but how his actions affected the broader mission of supporting our military and national security, she explained during one of our weekly strategy sessions. The media strategy was equally important. I began working with defense industry journalists to expose not just Derek's individual crimes, but the systemic problems in government contracting that allowed fraud to flourish unchecked. My speaking engagements at industry conferences about contractor accountability and the need for stronger whistleblower protections generated significant media coverage that kept pressure on federal agencies to take aggressive action against fraud. Derek's counterattack was predictable and desperate. He hired private investigators to conduct what his attorney called due diligence research into my background, looking for any personal or professional scandal that could discredit my testimony. When they found nothing more serious than a speeding ticket from 2019, Derek began spreading increasingly outrageous rumors about my mental stability and professional competence. His whisper campaign suggested that I was a disgruntled employee who had fabricated evidence to seek revenge for being rightfully terminated for poor performance. Derek's narrative painted me as an unstable woman who couldn't handle the pressure of major contract management and had suffered some kind of psychological breakdown that led to paranoid accusations against an innocent employer. But Derek's character assassination attempts backfired spectacularly. Every defense industry veteran who had worked with me over the past decade came forward publicly to vouch for my integrity, expertise, and psychological stability. Marcus Rodriguez wrote a detailed letter to the Washington Post, describing me as one of the most ethical and competent professionals I have encountered in 25 years of government contracting. Colonel Patricia Stevens, my former commanding officer in the Air Force, provided a statement to federal investigators that demolished Derek's attempts to question my mental stability. Madeline Patterson was one of the most reliable and ethically grounded officers I commanded during my 30-year military career. Her accusations against Derek Hartman should be taken seriously, precisely because she is not the kind of person who makes frivolous or vindictive allegations. 6 months after that devastating Monday when FBI agents raided Pinnacle's offices, federal prosecutors announced that Derek and 4 co-conspirators had been indicted on 18 felony charges, including conspiracy to defraud the federal government, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and witness intimidation. Derek's mugshot appeared on the front page of the Washington Post business section under the headline, "Defense Contractor CEO Charged in Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme." The photograph showed a broken man whose expensive suits and confident demeanor had been replaced by the orange jumpsuit and hollow stare of someone whose carefully constructed life had completely collapsed. Pinnacle Solutions filed for bankruptcy protection, unable to survive the complete loss of federal contracts and the massive legal fees associated with defending against criminal charges. But by that point, I was well established in my new role at NovaTek, leading a team of compliance specialists dedicated to preventing exactly the kind of fraud Derek had committed. My transformation from corporate employee to national advocate for ethical contracting was complete. I testified before congressional subcommittees about the need for stronger oversight of defense contractors. I consulted with companies across the industry wanting to implement comprehensive ethics programs. Most importantly, I had found work that aligned perfectly with my deepest values, protecting taxpayer dollars and supporting honest contractors who served the government with integrity. Derek Hartman's criminal trial began on a crisp October morning, 8 months after the FBI raid that had destroyed his company and exposed his crimes. The federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, was packed with reporters, defense industry professionals, and government officials who recognized that this case would set important precedents for how contractor fraud was prosecuted and punished. I spent 4 days on the witness stand, presenting the comprehensive evidence I had compiled against Derek over the previous 10 months. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Bank records showing the flow of stolen money from government accounts into Derek's personal offshore accounts, email evidence of his explicit instructions to inflate billing, and testimony from dozens of employees about his systematic retaliation against anyone who questioned his criminal practices. My testimony began with a detailed explanation of how government contracting was supposed to work, the ethical obligations that contractors accepted when they agreed to serve federal clients, and the specific ways that Derek had violated both legal requirements and moral standards. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," I said during my direct examination, "when a company like Pinnacle Solutions signs a contract to provide cybersecurity services to the federal government, they are accepting a sacred trust. They are promising to use taxpayer dollars efficiently and honestly to support missions that protect American lives and national security." The prosecution then walked me through each element of Derek's fraud scheme, using charts and financial documents to show how money intended for legitimate government services had been diverted into Derek's personal accounts and used to fund his luxury lifestyle. But the most shocking revelation of the trial came when prosecutors presented evidence that Derek's crimes were part of a much larger conspiracy involving corrupt federal procurement officials who had helped him rig competitions in exchange for cash bribes. Assistant U.S. Attorney Martinez revealed that Derek had been paying bribes to William Patterson, a senior procurement officer in the Department of Defense, who provided Derek with inside information about competing bids and helped him structure proposals that appeared to offer the best value while actually costing taxpayers millions in inflated charges. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. 26 defendants across 8 companies and 3 federal agencies, all connected through a web of bribery, fraud, and bid rigging that had cost taxpayers over $70 million in inflated contracts and stolen funds. Derek wasn't just a small-time fraudster. He was a key player in the largest defense contracting scandal in 15 years. During my cross-examination, Derek's defense attorneys attempted every possible strategy to discredit my testimony and shift blame away from their client. They suggested I was a disgruntled employee, seeking revenge for being fired. They questioned my motivations for reporting fraud. They even implied that I had somehow manipulated evidence to frame an innocent man who had been betrayed by overzealous subordinates. But their attacks only highlighted the strength of my credibility and the weakness of Derek's position. Under cross-examination, I remained calm and professional, explaining in clear terms how Derek's billing schemes worked, why they constituted theft from American taxpayers, and how his retaliation against ethical employees had created a culture of corruption at Pinnacle Solutions. Mr. Derek's attorneys have suggested that I fabricated evidence against him out of personal animosity, I said during one particularly aggressive cross-examination. I would ask the jury to consider whether someone seeking personal revenge would spend 18 months meticulously documenting financial irregularities that could easily be verified through independent audits of government records. The financial evidence against Derek was absolutely undeniable. Forensic accountants from the FBI traced $15.3 million in fraudulent billing directly from government accounts to Derek's personal offshore accounts, luxury purchases, and real estate investments. Derek's lavish lifestyle, funded entirely by stolen taxpayer money, was laid out in excruciating detail. A $4.1 million mansion in McLean, Virginia, a $2.7 million yacht moored in Annapolis, a $1.9 million vacation home in Aspen, and luxury cars, including a Ferrari, a Bentley, and a custom Porsche. The supporting testimony from former Pinnacle employees was equally damaging. Sarah Chen, the former finance director, broke down on the witness stand while describing how Derek had threatened to destroy her career and make her unemployable if she ever questioned his billing practices. He told me that I could either keep my mouth shut and keep my job, or I could find myself unemployed and blacklisted from every defense contractor in the Washington area, Sarah testified through tears. I have 2 children to support. I felt like I had no choice but to stay silent while he stole millions of dollars. Jennifer Walsh, the former employee whose initial fraud report had triggered the FBI investigation, testified about Derek's pattern of retaliating against women and minorities who questioned his business practices. Derek seemed to particularly target female employees and people of color for intimidation and termination when they raised ethical concerns, she explained. It was like he knew that we would have more difficulty finding new jobs and would be more vulnerable to his threats. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 18 counts. Derek's face went completely white as the foreman read each guilty verdict aloud, and his attorney had to physically support him to prevent him from collapsing. At the sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, I delivered a victim impact statement that focused not on my personal suffering, but on the broader damage Derek had inflicted on honest contractors, dedicated federal employees, and the American taxpayers whose trust he had betrayed. Your Honor, Derek Hartman didn't just steal money, I said, looking directly at Derek for the first time since his arrest. He corrupted an entire industry segment and betrayed the trust of military personnel who depend on ethical contractors to support their missions in dangerous places around the world. Derek's attempt at an apology during the sentencing hearing was pathetic and entirely self-serving. He blamed business pressures and industry practices for his criminal choices, while showing no genuine remorse for the lives he had damaged or the taxpayer dollars he had stolen. I never intended for things to go as far as they did, Derek said in a barely audible voice. The pressure to compete in government contracting led me to make choices that I deeply regret. Judge Catherine Morrison was clearly unimpressed by Derek's hollow apology. In sentencing Derek to 32 years in federal prison with full restitution ordered, she delivered a scathing rebuke that captured the true significance of his crimes. Mr. Hartman, you stole from the American people while hiding behind the flag and claiming to support the military personnel who risk their lives to defend our country. Your crimes represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust that our democratic system places in private contractors who serve the public interest. The sentence I am imposing today reflects not just the financial damage you caused, but the corruption you brought to an industry that plays a vital role in our national security. The broader impact of Derek's case extended far beyond his individual conviction. Congressional hearings led to comprehensive reforms in defense contracting oversight, including stronger whistleblower protections, more aggressive auditing of contractor billing practices, and criminal penalties for procurement officials who accepted bribes. My case became a textbook study in business schools and law schools across the country about the importance of ethical leadership and the devastating consequences of corporate corruption. More importantly for me personally, the national attention had established my reputation as one of the leading experts on contractor compliance and fraud prevention. 2 years later, as I stood at the podium of the Professional Services Council's annual conference in Washington, D.C., accepting the Ethics in Government Contracting Award, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from Derek's victim to a nationally recognized advocate for contractor integrity. My role as Director of Ethical Compliance at NovaTek had evolved into something far beyond what either Marcus Rodriguez or I had originally envisioned. I was now leading industry-wide initiatives to prevent fraud, designing compliance programs that had been adopted by over 50 defense contractors, and consulting with federal agencies on how to identify and prevent the kind of sophisticated fraud schemes Derek had pioneered. The financial transformation in my life had been significant, but secondary to the personal satisfaction of meaningful work. My salary at NovaTek was 67% higher than my pinnacle position, and my consulting income from companies seeking to implement ethical compliance programs had provided financial security I had never experienced before. But the real reward was waking up every morning knowing that my work was protecting taxpayer dollars and supporting honest contractors who served the government with integrity. Derek was serving his 32-year sentence in federal prison, and every asset he had purchased with stolen taxpayer money had been seized and sold at auction. The $4.1 million mansion, the luxury yacht, the vacation home in Aspen, and the collection of exotic cars had all been liquidated, with proceeds returned to the Treasury Department as partial restitution for his crimes. His wife had divorced him 8 months after his conviction, taking their 2 children and moving across the country to start over with a new last name and a completely new identity. The personal destruction Derek had brought on his own family was a reminder that criminal choices have consequences that extend far beyond the perpetrator. But Derek's downfall had created opportunities for hundreds of ethical contractors and federal employees who had previously been shut out of opportunities by his corrupt practices. Pinnacle's former employees had found new positions with companies that valued integrity over profit margins, often earning higher salaries and working in environments where ethical concerns were welcomed rather than punished. Sarah Chen, the former finance director who had been intimidated into silence about Derek's fraud, was now working as chief compliance officer at a respected defense contractor, using her painful experience with Derek's crimes to help other companies build robust fraud detection systems. "Madeline, I wake up every morning grateful that you had the courage I lacked," she told me during a recent industry conference. "Your actions didn't just stop Derek. They showed all of us that we have a moral obligation to speak up when we see wrongdoing." The policy changes inspired by my case had real and measurable impact on government contracting. The Derek Hartman Defense Contracting Reform Act, signed into law 18 months after his conviction, strengthened federal whistleblower protections, required more aggressive auditing of contractor billing practices, and established criminal penalties for procurement officials who accepted bribes or helped contractors commit fraud. My testimony before Congress had helped shape legislation that created the Office of Contractor Integrity, a new federal agency dedicated to investigating fraud and supporting employees who report criminal activity in government contracting. The office had already prosecuted 12 major fraud cases and recovered over $200 million in stolen taxpayer money. The Veterans Integrity Scholarship Fund, which I had established using speaking fees and consulting income, was providing financial support for military veterans entering business careers with a commitment to ethical leadership. The fund had awarded 37 scholarships in its first year, supporting former service members who brought military values of integrity and service to civilian careers in government contracting. My personal life had also flourished in ways I never could have imagined during those dark weeks when Derek was systematically destroying my professional reputation. I was engaged to David Peterson, a former Navy cybersecurity officer who worked for the Department of Homeland Security, and deeply admired both my technical expertise and my moral courage. David had proposed 6 months earlier during a weekend trip to Shenandoah National Park, telling me that my willingness to sacrifice personal security for ethical principles was the quality he most admired about me. "Madeline, you showed me that integrity isn't just a nice idea. It's something worth fighting for, even when the personal cost is enormous." Marcus Rodriguez had become both a mentor and a close friend, helping me develop the executive leadership skills necessary for my expanding role as a national advocate for ethical contracting. Under his guidance, I had become one of the most sought-after speakers at military academies and business schools, sharing my experience about maintaining moral courage under pressure and the long-term rewards of choosing integrity over personal advancement. Just last month, Federal Times magazine had honored me as one of the top 40 professionals, under 40, in defense contracting. Recognition that was gratifying but secondary to the personal satisfaction of knowing that my work was making a real difference in protecting national security and taxpayer interests. The closing scene of this remarkable journey had taken place the previous evening at the same luxury hotel where Derek had once fired me via text message. This time, I was the honored guest receiving an award for ethical leadership, surrounded by industry leaders who respected my expertise and moral courage. As I stood at that podium, looking out at an audience of over 400 defense industry professionals, I reflected on how Derek's act of petty cruelty had actually liberated me from a toxic environment and launched me into the most meaningful work of my career. "The question I want to leave you with tonight," I said in my acceptance speech, "is simply this. When faced with a choice between doing what's convenient and doing what's right, which path will you choose? The easy path might seem attractive in the short term, but the right path leads to the kind of personal integrity and professional satisfaction that money cannot buy." Looking back on that devastating moment at the charity gala when I received Derek's termination text message, I now understand that his betrayal was actually the beginning of my liberation. The short-term pain of standing up to corruption had led to long-term success, meaningful work, and the kind of personal integrity that makes every day feel like a contribution to something larger than myself. Derek had intended to destroy my career as punishment for threatening to expose his crimes. Instead, his cruelty had accelerated my promotion into work that aligned perfectly with my deepest values and provided a platform for protecting other employees from the kind of retaliation he had attempted to use against me. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is straightforward, but not simple. Document everything. Trust your moral compass. Build alliances with people who share your values. And remember that ethical stands often involve short-term costs that lead to long-term rewards you cannot yet imagine. The defense industry, like every industry, needs people who are willing to prioritize integrity over convenience, who will protect taxpayer dollars even when it's personally costly, and who understand that our work ultimately serves the military personnel who depend on ethical contractors to support missions that protect American lives and national security. Sometimes the worst betrayal becomes the doorway to your greatest triumph, but only if you have the courage to walk through that doorway when it opens in front of you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where standing up for your values came at a personal cost, but ultimately led to something better than what you had before? I would love to hear your stories about the power of ethical courage in the comments below. Your experiences might inspire someone else who is facing their own moment of moral decision. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about overcoming workplace challenges and the long-term rewards of choosing integrity over convenience. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the power of moral courage in professional settings. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes the most devastating betrayal can become the foundation for your most meaningful triumph. Trust your values, document everything, and never let anyone convince you that staying silent about wrongdoing is the safe choice. The safe choice is always doing the right thing, even when the personal cost seems overwhelming.